Oh, hello there. Hello, child. I'm so grateful you stumbled upon this video because you're special and capable of anything.
What kind of person can guide 11 of their closest friends to death, be the sole benefactor of their wills, and get away with it? The kind of person who's primarily focused on the conscious development of mind, body, and soul. The kind of person fighting black lords with magic gems and psychic shields. Today on Creepshow, the show by creeps for creeps about creeps and creepy things, we'll be talking about Terri Hoffman and her spiritual organization. Let's get it on. Terri Hoffman was born March 21, 1938, to her father and particularly loving mother, and from the very beginning, her life was marked with tragedy. As a child in Fort Stockton, Texas, Terri had trouble making friends, but she was excited. Mother and father had sat her down and told her she would soon have a beautiful baby sister. It would mean even less food on the table for the poverty-stricken family, but they counted her as a blessing nonetheless. But Terri would never have the chance to meet her new friend. The family was devastated when the new baby was stillborn, and mother fell ill with tuberculosis soon after, passing away as well, leaving Terri in the care of her alcoholic father. The other children were cruel, and their families looked down on the Hoffmans and their less than well-to-do lifestyle, so Terri would often play alone. One day when Terri was 4, she had been out playing and was relaxing in the shade of a tree, when 3 robed men appeared to her in a burst of light. The men told Terri she was capable of anything she wanted bad enough because she was special. They told her to think of God, and they told her that none of the other children would be able to see them, so she mustn't tell anyone. She was confused why God would have made her life so painful, but she kept what the men had said in mind, even though they wouldn't reappear to her for more than 5 years. At 9 years old, Terri was brought to a Lutheran orphanage by her father and never saw him again. But it was at the orphanage she did see 3 familiar men, who taught her to pray to God, and so it was here through the power of prayer she would have another vision, in which she would meet Jesus. No big deal. At the orphanage, she would also meet a Lutheran nun, who would teach her all about totally Lutheran things like the elements, fire, water, air, earth, and ether, the Akashic records in the spiritual realm, which was a place she could reach through meditation, where she could learn, quote, the past, present, and future laid out like farmland through an airplane window. She also learned about the Lutheran belief, reincarnation, which made her doubts in God about the loss of her sister justified. The more I hear about this nun, the more I wonder if she was just one of Terri's visions too. She doesn't really sound Lutheran to me. Terri would remain at the orphanage until the age of 11, honing her spiritual craft and eventually realizing, oh, duh, I'm the reincarnation of Saint Teresa of Avila, one of Christianity's most famous mystics. It was then she would be adopted by the loving Benson family, who had lost their own daughter to tuberculosis a few years earlier. She would be enrolled in school and was, for the first time, given a chance at a normal life. But maybe Terri was accustomed to change, or maybe she had a hard time trusting people, which, after being dropped off at an orphanage by your father and losing everybody you love, is kinda understandable. Because 4 years later, Terri would meet an 18-year-old truck driver making 85 cents an hour. Described by Terri's adoptive mother as a thug, John Wilder was soon to be Terri's husband, as soon as they could drive to a state that would marry the newly 15-year-old, that is. That state was Oklahoma. In 1953, Terri would marry, and within 2 years, Terri and John would have their first daughter, Kathy. It was in 1954 Terri began to explore her interests, meeting with people to meditate and discuss the nature of the universe and hippy-dippy stuff like that. Over the years, her interests and involvement with spirituality would grow, and she would have 2 more children with John, Kenneth, born 1958, and Virginia in 1963. But eventually, the marriage would begin to crumble. Terri had begun to amass what could only be described as a group of followers. They didn't believe she was a simple housewife. They believed she was in direct communication with God. And she began to believe it too. In the late 60s, she apparently saved a young man's life from his drug habit with the power of prayer and meditation. And the young man was so impressed, he begged her to share her gift with his friends. And so, Terri would begin to hold weekly meditations for dozens of teens. But she did her best to impart healthy lifestyle choices, teach patience and understanding with the youth's parents, and steer the kids away from drugs. So, she seemed alright. According to a man who attended one of these sessions and stopped going, it seemed a bit more like hypnosis than a guided meditation. Terri would essentially become a spiritual tour guide, and her disciples would visit higher planes of existence and visit the spiritual masters, such as Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad.
I would like to inform you some of our rules and regulations. First, please be seated until we reach our destination. Second, please take extra care of your valuable things.
She would also play fortune teller to the young kids, telling them which couples had found their soulmates using the Akashic records, of course, breaking up some young couples and giving unrealistic hope to others. And she could heal the sick. She healed her son Kenneth's broken thumb. Apparently. At least she told everybody she did. They were at a picnic together and he broke it so bad you could see the bones sticking out of his skin. And she didn't want to take him to the hospital because they could just meditate at home. Duh. She could levitate. She predicted car accidents, telling the kids,
"You have to come meditate tonight or you'll die in a car crash."
One time after Jimi Hendrix had died, she told the group they should summon him because he made beautiful music. They apparently did, and Terri beamed. Remind you of anyone?
Now, Mac Miller unfortunately passed away today. He was one of my favorite musicians. We're gonna light it up right now, guys. Today we're going to do an EVP session to try to communicate with Mac Miller.
She was basically an all-around miracle worker, and the kids really did worship her for a while. You see, some of the claims were a little wild, some were a bit creepy, and for someone who talked about a humble lifestyle like Jesus or Buddha, she sure bragged about her new boat a lot. The late 60s was when Terri and John's marriage would start to come to a close. He was uncomfortable with what she was doing. As Terri had gained followers, she began doing consultations with adults and calling her organization Conscious Development of Body, Mind, and Soul, for which she began taking donations, usually $50 to $100 per session with client. To be frank, John thought Terri was peddling a load of dog shit. He was also uncomfortable with the college boy, Chuck, who attended every meditation and would sit next to Terri to hold her hand. And then there was Sandra, the young lady who referred to Terri as Jesus and would give her excessive amounts of jewelry and money. Terri would divorce from John in 1970. The same year, she would also be taken in for psychiatric evaluation. John and her adopted mother had signed the papers. In the divorce, Terri would lose the family's savings, custody of the 2 younger children, the house, the furniture, but she got to keep the teenage daughter, some shares, her Mustang, a shotgun, and a pistol. Terri, 33 at the time, would soon go on to marry a 20-year-old man named Glenn Cooley. They would move to Dallas and purchase a house together at 4163 Dunhaven Drive to continue on their mission, to expand the conscious development of body, mind, and soul literature. Sandy Cleaver had become a close friend of the couple, sharing in their love of spirituality, jewelry, and Terri, and she tagged along. After Sandy's father had passed, she developed an interest in spirituality, homeopathic medicines, Silva mind control, and other New Age beliefs. She married a man named Chuck Cleaver, and together they had a daughter, whom they named Susan Devereaux Cleaver, after Sandy's sister. Once Sandy began getting involved in conscious development, her relationship with Chuck began to dissolve. She would tell Chuck he was impeding on her spiritual development. He didn't exactly feel comfortable with the fact that Sandy was so obsessed with Terri, giving her basically all the money she was making, all of her most expensive jewelry, and involving Susan in the group's weird gatherings as well. And he made it known. Sandy apparently responded,
I really have to help Susan overcome all the problems that are caused by your bad vibrations, your bad feelings about Terri.
Susan would fall ill with scarlet fever, and despite Sandy arguing Susan would be better off in heaven, Chuck would stay up all night to sneak her off to get her treated by real doctors. Terri informed Sandy that she was capable of curing cancer, healing wounds, relieving drug addictions, but the one thing she wasn't capable of was preventing the negative energies of Chuck from affecting their daughter. And so, in 1971, Sandy divorced from Chuck, resulting in a messy custody battle. Sandy would beg neighbors to vouch for her being sane and being a good mother, and Chuck would gather all the evidence he could to the contrary. His lawyers were worried, though. Not about the result of the case. They knew they would win, but the outcome afterwards. They told Chuck that if he won, Sandy would likely try to kill Susan, and Chuck agreed. So they rethought their approach. They decided they would forfeit custody with visitation if Sandy would legally agree to taking Susan to physicians, real physicians, if necessary. Before the divorce was even finalized, Sandy paid for Terri and Glenn's honeymoon, and tagged along, taking Susan, despite court orders that she wasn't allowed to leave the state. After the divorce, Terri and Sandy became even more obsessed with each other, or at least Sandy with Terri. She would make and sell jewelry, contributing the profits to the cult, going on long trips and leaving Susan behind after winning custody of her. She even bought the cult a printing press. And with advertisements, word of mouth, and the reputation spreading, conscious development was really catching on in Dallas. By 1974, they had around 110 local students. But people would again begin to grow suspicious. Certain promises made were never kept, and people started noticing Terri was kind of recycling and repeating lines, calling different people the reincarnation of the same famous historical person, and pocketing literally all of the foundation's money for herself. She also insisted she was the New Age Jesus, or the brightest shining star of our time. Details such as these were not public knowledge, and so the members continued to join, but would be sworn to secrecy upon joining. Also, Terri would use her influence to guilt and gaslight the members to getting what she wanted out of them, which was usually money. Terri would eventually appoint around 40 people in what she would call a teachers group, informing them they were elite spiritual masters put on Earth to help their fellow man. This plot advancement also soon got boring to Terri, however, and she decided she would spice things up a bit. She came to the group, telling them upon meditating, the spiritual masters had appeared to her again, and told her that there were two forces in the world, good and evil, as if this was some kind of huge revelation. She was told that they were the ones fighting for good, and their battle would take place on the spiritual realm. Their enemies? The Black Lords. You see, Terri was instrumental in this battle for the fate of humanity, because, as usual, nobody else could see the beings Terri talked about. The Black Lords disrupted the physical plane with negative vibrations, and they were so dangerous only the appointed teachers, now known as the White Brotherhood, could know about them. For the weaker minds of the common folk would of course crumble to their influence. Only the most brainwashed, indoctrinated, subservient members could know, because of the danger. No other reason than that. That would just be silly. That would be weird. Wouldn't make sense, right? To defeat the Dark Lords, Terri would need to bring them to the pits of hell, where their, quote, soul and lower bodies would be destroyed. I don't know if that just means like the lower half of their bodies, or like their lower beings' bodies. I don't know. But there were also Dark Masters, who could only be killed in electromagnetic caves. Obviously, the lava in the pits of hell wouldn't cut it, but electromagnetic. What?
You stupid.
And so the meetings of the White Brotherhood would begin to consist of intense battles. The teachers would be asked to bring objects that could attune each archangel that represented the elements, bringing a cup, fan, sword, rod, and robe, as well as a cloth circle they could sit on, chant incantations, and prepare a circle of protection. These items were meant to attune their abilities to the archangels. All but the rod and the robe, which had greater purpose. The rod was a weapon, and they would use it to fight the Black Lords. The robe offered great spiritual defense that they would be powerless without. Terri would direct the teachers where the Black Lords were hiding in the room they performed their meetings. She would point to a corner, and the members would point their rods and chant, teleporting the Black Lords to hell and eliminating them in the pits. Terri, at the end of the meetings, would recount how many Black Lords had been slain. Sometimes it was in the double digits, but it was never enough. The meetings would get more frequent, and she would call emergency meetings late at night and without notice. But why would the teachers complain? Terri was absorbing all the pain they should be experiencing in the battles. A true selfless leader. And who would they complain to? You see, anyone weak enough to be manipulated by the Black Lords couldn't be trusted, and that was literally everyone outside of Terri's circle. She was reported to have told the group in one of these meetings,
Stay alert. Curtail most of your social contact with those outside the group. It's for their protection. The Black Forces may use them to get to you. Keep your sword near you, especially when you go to bed. Protect your animals, car, place of work, and your home with protection rituals.
You know when someone's in an abusive relationship and their partner doesn't want anybody else involved in their affairs because they're worried a bit of common sense might sneak its way in? I'm just asking a question. It's irrelevant. Through all of this craziness, Glenn, Terri's husband, started to do exactly what he wasn't supposed to do, and talk to outside members. He began to complain to his mom, saying he wanted to leave conscious development and Terri. His mom supported him. She'd always had a problem with Terri. She didn't like the fact that she was nearly twice his age, or that she would wait outside honking if he took more than half an hour to visit, and really, she didn't think the substitution of conscious development was actually a good alternative to the drug addiction he suffered from before. Both seemed equally as dangerous to her. I guess this news became known to Terri because November 24th, 1976, Terri filed for an amicable divorce from Glenn. 5 days later, he signed a waiver allowing for the speedy processing of the matter. Alice and Don Hoffman were two of the teachers appointed to the White Brotherhood. They joined the group in 1973 after their daughter drowned in their swimming pool, and quickly became deeply involved and trusted members of the group. On January 27th, Terri would be granted her divorce, and 6 days later, in a meeting Terri wouldn't attend, Alice announced to the group that Glenn was dead. On February 2nd, Terri claims she opened up her safe and found a note inside. It was from Glenn, and said,
I, Glenn Cooley, give to Terri Cooley all of my property, both personal and real. This includes 2 boats, a 1972 Buick Limited, all jewelry and equipment for its making, all furnishings for the house on Dunhaven Road, and all cash. I ask that this last will of mine not be contested by anyone in any way for any reason. Last but not least, I give all my love to all my family and friends. As explanation for this, I can't really say what it is because of, but I can say what it is not because of. It is not because of divorce with Terri, past drug experiences, inability to cope, etc. What it is, I myself know, but don't have the words for.
And so, it was obvious. The Black Lords had gotten to Glenn. He was found with half a beer and a couple pills near him, and his death was ruled an overdose. According to Glenn's mother, at the funeral she would see Terri crying into her hands, and then stop to look up and see if anyone was watching, and if they were, she would keep crying. Maybe she wasn't upset, she was just angry at the Black Lords, but nobody could know about them, so she had to fake being sad. Yeah, that's probably it. The battles clearly weren't working to eradicate the dark scourge that was the Black Lords. They would need to step up their efforts, and so Terri would begin the bloodletting. The Dark Lords were poisoning the members' blood, and obviously the only way to remedy that was to drain the poisoned blood out. Each draining was only a small vial, like that taken on a visit to the doctor. But still, this new practice made some of the members a little uncomfortable. They began to fear they were losing their free will and would eventually lose their property, all their earnings, and even their lives to the group. So, people began to leave. obviously under the influence of the Black Lords, yet Sandy's allegiance to Terri only grew stronger. Terri was pleased with Sandy's loyalty, but wasn't too pleased with her daughter Susan. You see, a Black Lord had attached itself to her. I wonder why, Chuck. She'd become a great, powerful, negative being, and she was attacking Terri, which wasn't acceptable. She was punished and isolated. The teachers didn't agree with the treatment of Susan. They believed she needed prayer and positive energy, not more negative. But who would have the balls to stand up to Terri, the one divine being? Certainly not Sandy, who in 1978 drafted her will, leaving her antiques, home, bank accounts, and inheritance, which provided her about $20,000 a year, to who else but Terri. Susan wasn't even mentioned in it, but why would she be? She had a large trust fund from the inheritance as well, amounting to around $125,000, which, a couple days later, she would write in her will to Conscious Develop. Now, I know what you're thinking. What kind of 15-year-old girl writes a will? Well, legally it didn't count for anything in Texas at that age, but you have to remember, Susan was overtaken by Black Lords. She knew her time on the earth was limited, so she wanted her intentions known. What a sweetheart. She actually wrote 2 wills. One was more informal, and left all of her money for the sole purpose of developing a school for conscious development, leaving a few trinkets to her mom and dad and some books for her school library too. But then, she rewrote it a few days later. This time it was a bit more professional, to the point it seemed like someone else had written it entirely. But the writing was witnessed by 2 members of Conscious Development and notarized by Alice Hoffman. It said,
I give, devise, and bequeath all of my property, including all rights, titles, and interests of whatever character I may own in and to any property, real, personal, or mixed, wherever situated, to Terri Johnson, who has been to me like a second mother.
Giving Terri the freedom to use the money for whatever she wanted. If Susan were to die, of course. But, of course, Susan were to die. Even a few weeks before her death, Susan made it clear she wanted to live with her father and have a normal life with friends. Her friends said it was bullshit that she thought of Terri as a second mother. She was embarrassed of her own mother in Conscious Development and hated Terri. December 1978, Susan would be given the choice which parent she wanted to live with, and surprisingly, she chose Sandy and Conscious Development. According to her father, she came home one weekend before the decision, excited that suddenly her and Sandy were getting along. She even wrote to one of her friends explaining her sudden change of heart, saying,
She is so sweet and considerate, and I really like her. And I'm not joking, although you're probably thinking I'm wacky.
It was because of this newfound friendship with her mother that Susan was beyond excited to once again take a trip to Hawaii for the honeymoon of a group member. And while in Hawaii, on February 25th, 1979, just a few months after deciding to live with the cult, Sandy and Susan waded out on a raft to a lagoon Sandy had been to before. It wasn't a suitable lagoon for rafting or swimming, mainly just crab fishing, because of the quick break over razor-sharp coral. Surprisingly to probably no one, a wave hit the raft and knocked mother and daughter into the cascading blue waves of the beautiful Hawaiian reef. Susan, a strong swimmer, was soon crying, telling her mother she was scared, and just as soon, she disappeared from view. Sandy allegedly dove underwater to look for Susan and woke up on the beach. She called the fire department and Chuck to tell him their daughter was missing. Within a day, Chuck was on a plane to Hawaii, and as soon as he left, he received a voicemail at home, informing him that Conscious Development was in possession of a will he would want to see. He visited Sandy in the hospital, who was acting like any grieving mother would, bawling her eyes out, thanking Chuck, and apologizing to him for letting Susan out of her sight. That is, until Terri walked in, when Sandy immediately seemed to enter a trance-like state, wiping her tears and saying,
Susan will be happier in heaven.
So the vacation was over, and Chuck and the members of Conscious Development returned home to Texas. But after the incident in the ocean, Sandy was never the same again. Usually an organized person, Sandy became unraveled. She called off her wedding plans, which is when her brother advised her to keep away from Terri. Sandy, of course, refused and became offended, and convinced he would try to prevent her from leaving her estate in Terri's name in the chance of her death. One of Sandy's friends called her to check up on her a few months after the drowning. When she did, Sandy insisted she should come to visit, and they could meditate and have Susan visit too. And
Not to worry if she was all messed up with blood and stuff, because she had to hurry to see them, and Jesus didn't have the time to clean her up.
within 2 months of Susan drowning, Sandy would take out a $300,000 life insurance policy to be paid to Terri in the event of her death. And that's basically just the beginning. But I've already been going on for so long that we're going to stop here for now and be back with part 2 next week, where we'll learn about the 9 other deaths. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to know when part 2 is out. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a disturbing day.